image, the TV is rendering more and more of the image. So the further we get in rendering the image, the more of the frame we actually end up capturing, which is why we end up with a final image that's basically a composite of 2 frames split by a diagonal line. Now, as soon as we try and visualize these two things together at once, it's much easier to understand how we end up with the resulting still frame in the video, which looks an awful lot like the frame from Steve's transition, and clearly demonstrates how the arcade transitions can be 100% consistent, and yet we can still see weird or confusing images when frame by framing through videos online. Now, to complicate things a little bit further, not all cameras suffer from this rolling shutter effect, with some effectively capturing everything onto the sensor at once, which can give a slightly different set of things to consider, and on top of that, not all of the quote-unquote anomalous transitional images are as straightforward as this. So now with all that out of the way, let's return back to this example.
As you can see, they are different and shows the inconsistent loading match of the stage. This could be due to a number of reasons that no professional expert in the field has come forward to explain.
I'm no professional expert in the field, but I'll take a crack at explaining how we could very plausibly get something like this, which is an example that I purposefully chose as being one of the most difficult to explain, as it actually contains elements from all 4 of those transition frames, coupled with basically all of the other phenomena that I just explained. First, the CRT fully draws frame number 1. Now, as it begins to draw frame number 2, the pixels that were lit up on the display for the first frame begin to fade out. But again, this isn't instantaneous because of the phosphor persistence. The CRT then begins to draw frame number 3, which is when the camera begins capturing its image. And in this case, all evidence points to the footage being from a CCD camera without the rolling shutter issue, recording roughly 30 FPS interlaced video, which if you recall means that every frame of the final video recording is actually composed of 2 different images captured at just under 60 fields per second stitched together. Now, the camera sensor takes a near instantaneous snapshot of the image for the first of its 2 interlaced frames, which captures the tail end of the first transition frame as those pixels are still partially illuminated, most of the second frame with the 5 girders, and even a tiny portion of the third frame. The CRT then finishes drawing the third transitional frame and begins drawing the final frame. 1 frame's worth of time has elapsed since we captured the first field, so now the camera snapshots the image data onto its sensor for the second field of the frame. Now, this would leave us with this resulting composite image, which as far as I can tell contains exactly all of the same elements we see in the example frame that was said had not been explained. Because this frame is the result of interlacing 2 images together, any of the girders, ladders, or other areas where common pixels are illuminated across more than one of the frames are noticeably brighter than the others. The pixels in the 5 girder pattern are shared between the second and third frames of the transition. The pixels that were still barely illuminated from the dimming of the stack of gorillas that overlap with the girders from the following frames brightens up these areas on those girders. And this even explains the very specific pattern we see on the left side of the screen, with the bright rectangular portions of the girders that extend all the way to the left side, as well as the slightly dimmer portion in the bottom left-hand corner. The third frame of the transition contains the top 3 girders, but this frame doesn't include the bottom left-hand portion of the bottom girder. But the snippet of the last frame that the camera captures contains all 4 of these girders, 3 of them having shared pixels between the 2, which is why they're much brighter than the bottom one. And it also explains the small gap here, which you should now instantly recognize as being caused by the CRT scan line not yet making it far enough when drawing the 4th frame to fill in that gap. These transitions on arcade, as well as the transitions on MAME, are, as far as I can tell, as close to 100% reliable and consistent as we could reasonably say, and everybody that's tried to debunk this idea for the last 5 years has utterly failed. Any images that we come across that are not consistent with these transition screens are almost definitely caused by something external to the game's transition screens themselves. Until somebody's able to demonstrate some way for an original unmodified arcade PCB to reproducibly output these very clear and specific MAME transitions, I genuinely don't believe that there's any other reasonable conclusion that we can come to other than Billy's records were done using MAME.
So to me, because of this inconsistency, there's just nothing to stand on because they have similarities, which is supposed to make sense. One's an emulator. It's supposed to emulate the arcade, so there's supposed to be certain things similar.
The unfortunate side effect of these kinds of responses is that despite him not really knowing what he's talking about at all, and getting it all wrong, he speaks so confidently that anybody who doesn't fully understand the concepts here can easily be convinced that, at the very least, this one guy just casts serious doubt on the entire case against Billy, giving those people a false impression that Twin Galaxy's findings were baseless or unjustified. Now, whenever I have the chance to collect my own evidence, to do my own testing, and to come to my own conclusions about anything remotely interesting or important to me, I try to take the opportunity. So even as compelling and overwhelming as the evidence presented thus far was for me personally, I felt like I needed that additional layer of confidence that comes from independently coming to my own conclusion, especially if I'm going to be making a video sharing my personal opinions or judgments related to another person's character or actions. So there were 5 things that I personally felt needed to be researched before I could totally be on board with Jeremy Young's accusations. The first was to personally examine all of the available footage that I could find of Billy's gameplay, examining the transitional frames for indications of gameplay, attempt to identify arcade-specific indications that would contradict the conclusion that it couldn't have been done on arcade, to verify that this was the same footage that Jeremy Young used in his analysis, and to ensure that the evidence he presented wasn't cherry-picked or misleading in any way. Second was to personally install and test various versions of MAME to become familiar with how it's used and to be able to gather my own footage for my own independent analysis, trying to replicate the results of Jeremy Young's research. The third was to collect as large a sample size as possible of outside video footage of genuine arcade Donkey Kong gameplay, captured in as many different ways as possible, so I could study all of the footage and see if there are any inconsistencies, discrepancies in behavior, any patterns, or if I could make any observations that didn't fit into the MAME versus arcade model. The fourth was an idea that I had to try and replicate what would be the most absurd, yet still plausible, chain of events regarding the production of video footage for analysis, to try to attempt to learn if actual footage of legitimate original Donkey Kong gameplay could have anything unintentionally done to it that would result in it being considered suspicious or remotely MAME-like. Finally, the fifth was to personally capture genuine Donkey Kong arcade gameplay on video for my own analysis as a final sanity check separate from any outside sources. Now, while the question of whether or not the footage that's purported to be Billy's is actually his or not is a question for another time, for now, I wanted to go through that footage and do my own analysis. What was interesting is that there are seemingly a few different versions of the same score videos that have been uploaded to YouTube by various sources over the years. Now, this is very helpful as it provides multiple sources of the same alleged footage, which could potentially reduce the amount of observations that we see that are either missing or inconclusive. Although in order to consider all of these different versions of allegedly the same footage, I first needed to cross-reference each version with the others to ensure that they weren't recordings of different gameplay, rendering one or more of them obviously not the gameplay in question. And while the different versions of this footage appear to have been recorded at different times, with video of slightly different dimensions and to varying degrees of quality, I was unable to find a single instance of any indications that they were not the same footage. As far as I could tell, these videos showed the same exact gameplay. So that being said, when it came to all of the personal analysis that I did of all of the footage of Billy's gameplay, everything I found was entirely consistent with what Jeremy Young presented. Anything that wasn't inconclusive clearly showed zero arcade-specific indications, and instead, what was found throughout pretty much every video were a considerable number of MAME-specific indications. Now, at this point, it was important that I do my own independent analysis of MAME to try to get familiar with how it works in general, learn some of its capabilities, and get a sense for the kinds of things that you can do with it in terms of custom configurations and settings, something that'll be super important a bit later on. Once I was able to get everything up and running consistently, ensuring that I tested a handful of different versions, some overlapping with the versions that Jeremy Young used to test, as well as ensuring that I tossed in a few random versions as well for good measure, I then got to collecting as many samples of MAME Donkey Kong screen transitions as I could. Now, getting my own personal first-hand experience using MAME was not only a prerequisite for feeling more comfortable about my ability to objectively analyze the conclusions that other people like Jeremy had come to, but it was also super valuable as it served to introduce me to some additional quirks and behaviors that specifically MAME Donkey Kong exhibits, which fortunately provides us with even more opportunities to distinguish MAME play from genuine arcade gameplay. One example is what's shown when the game is initially launched, which on arcade gives us a brief flash of a seemingly random jumble of multicolored characters and sprites, a pattern that's unique to every arcade PCB, referred to as a rug pattern. Now, conveniently, none of Billy's record footage ever shows the game being launched or reset. The recording always seems to start after this, so we never actually get a chance to make this comparison, which is unfortunate, as this is something that's not too uncommon from many other record submission videos that I saw, like this one from Steve Wiebe.
Hello, this is Steve Wiebe here. I'm gonna restart the machine and play a game Donkey Kong.
Now let's compare that to MAME's loading screen, which, looking at some of my loading footage, we can see a wall of multicolored zeros. Another aspect of genuine arcade gameplay that would be a valuable piece of evidence for Billy that isn't present in any of his videos is sound. MAME historically has a number of incorrect sound effects for Donkey Kong, So if audio was included in his video and didn't have any anomalous sound effects, that would have been really good for his case. Now we even know the converter that Billy claims to have used to capture his footage, and we know that it's capable of recording audio. So, once again, we have one more element that's blatantly different between Arcade and MAME that also just so happens to be conveniently missing from all of Billy's submission tapes. In my testing, a number of different versions of MAME had some sound effects that seemed fine, but then I'd hit entire sections that would be totally silent and other sections that would play totally weird, broken-sounding audio that, if present on any gameplay footage, would be a dead giveaway for MAME. Now the last missing Arcade signature that I want to discuss is known as the rivet ramp, which occurs when the rivet stage is completed and the blue girders below DK collapse underneath him. These blue girders are rendered in the same way that the other elements, like the red girders and ladders on other stages are, and when played on Arcade, what this means is that during the collapse we can see what looks like a stepwise stack of girders that form a kind of ramp, while on MAME, the collapse is instantaneous, so you never see the ramp. Now, as expected, this is missing from every example that I can find in Billy's footage. Now, of course, it needs to be said that there's a number of plausible explanations as to why one or more of these could be missing from any of the footage, depending on how they were recorded, how they were uploaded and compressed, so the absence of evidence here doesn't really tell us anything definitive. Maybe this transition is rare or hard to capture. Or looking back at that Steve Wiebe video that I just showed you a moment ago, if we look at the first 3 rivet stage completions, we see that the first, second, and third all clearly show the rivet ramp. Man, either everybody else is just really lucky, Billy's just extremely unlucky, or perhaps maybe, just maybe, he wasn't playing on Arcade. So, with all of that being said, when it came to my own personal MAME testing and analysis, everything that Jeremy Young presented was entirely consistent with my personal findings. After compiling as many different original Donkey Kong Cabinet gameplay videos as I possibly could, going back a decade more in time, including a wide range of completely independent and unrelated sources, a wide array of recording setups, direct feed, handheld cameras, cell phone cameras, all kinds of different frame rate combinations, viewing angles, rendered and uploading using all kinds of different software at different times, everything I observed was entirely consistent with what Jeremy Young presented. I never once witnessed a single frame that looked anything like MAME, and every single video I watched contained at least one arcade-specific indication. Now, if you have any reasonable doubt at all, which you shouldn't take my word for it, this is the easiest thing that any of you watching this video can test for yourself. Go find a YouTube video that claims to show original arcade gameplay. Pause the video right before one of these scene transitions, and use the period or comma keys on your keyboard to go frame by frame. What I predict that you're going to see most commonly is going to be a single frame that's basically a mashup of one or more arcade-specific frames, either catching the CRT partway through drawing one frame while the previous is still lit up on screen, or sometimes even diagonally cut off due to the rolling shutter effect, with the occasional case of the initial frame of the transition being lost entirely, which can easily happen for a number of totally normal, mundane reasons, and is ultimately inconclusive. What I can pretty much guarantee that you won't see is anything that looks remotely like MAME. Now, moving on, the fourth thing I wanted to test was admittedly in response to a very specific claim made by Billy.
One problem is a screen goes 60 times a second, and then it's a copy. That's why we want the original. And it's a copy of a copy. And then it's from analog to digital. It's played on the TV screen, and then they film the screen. There's all loads of stuff missing, and that's why there's so much that's inconclusive.
After hearing him say that, the question I had was, could I reasonably fuck up some legitimate video footage enough to either get quote-unquote loads of stuff missing, or to introduce anything that looked remotely MAME-like? I wanted to start with source material that was as close as possible to Billy's video, and ultimately I think I found a pretty good candidate. This video is from 2007, where it appears as though a number of folks related to the story on one side of the argument or another are at FunSpot, watching a record submission tape from Steve Wiebe, being fairly skeptical about the legitimacy of his gameplay for a number of different reasons that honestly we don't have to get into right now. I'm not interested in doing some kind of debunk on the claims in this video. I only say that more so to point out that I think it's interesting that one of the things brought up is the potential for MAME shenanigans here. More than 15 years before, we'd finally have the knowledge to be able to do this kind of video analysis.
Could have actually taken the main game, the save state, put it direct feed through a monitor, put it in the cabinet, and had a million points. Like, You have to go through and analyze stuff because there's so much stuff you can do to cheat if you really want to.
This video is an example of a reasonably similar set of circumstances to much of what we see in Billy's videos, using the same kinds of technology from the same time period. The major difference here is that Billy claims his footage came from a direct feed out of the arcade cabinet, whereas Steve's footage is from a camera recording his gameplay. Although, if anything, this difference is not in Steve's favor, as his video is simply not going to be as clean as if it were a direct feed recording, so there's more opportunities for something to be introduced into the video that might make it look suspicious. Let's use what we learned to go through the transitions shown in this video. Now, unfortunately, within the 15-minute video, we can only see 4 screen transitions, but this is nevertheless 4 opportunities to corroborate some of the claims being made here. What we're seeing when we watch this video is supposed to be video footage of gameplay done on an original Donkey Kong arcade machine, with a camera on a tripod recording the gameplay shown on the cabinet's monitor. The assumption here that we're testing is that Steve Wiebe was using the setup that we saw him use in the King of Kong. Now, according to Billy, we already have one potential source for some kind of artifacts to be introduced to the video that could possibly make the gameplay appear to be MAME. A camera pointed at a screen with all kinds of things like inconsistent frame rates and the potential for rolling shutter. Now, next is a bit of an assumption, but I would think that he would have made a copy of the tape before submitting it to Twin Galaxies. I don't know about you, but if the only evidence that I had of a world record was a single VHS tape, I'd probably want to make as clean a copy as I could and send that in, holding on to the original myself, just in case it were to get lost in the mail or something. Nevertheless, according to Billy, that's one more potential source for MAME-like indications to be introduced. Now, the copy of that tape was then played on a different TV screen, and then also recorded with a second handheld camera, then digitally converted, compressed, and uploaded to YouTube. Now, my hypothesis is that this gameplay was done on arcade hardware, not MAME, and as such, I predict that we will not see a single MAME indication. We should see at least one arcade-specific indication, and will very likely see one or more cases where rolling shutter or drop frames will make the transitions inconclusive. And you know what? Fuck it. Let's take it one step further. I grabbed my cell phone, pointed it at the screen, recording my monitor playing the YouTube video, and then I sent the video to myself through Discord, where Discord's compression makes the video look like it's being played back on a TI-83 graphing calculator. Now, seriously, this is what the resulting raw video from Discord looks like being played back inside my video editor. Now, to quickly recap before I show you the results, what we have here is an insanely compressed version of a cell phone video that recorded a monitor playing back a YouTube video of a 16-year-old video taken on a shaky-ass handheld camera, pointed at a shitty television, playing back a VHS tape that was a copy of another VHS tape recorded from a handheld camera pointed at an arcade CRT monitor. There's got to be no way that we can see anything remotely conclusive here. And if anything, it should look all sus and MAME-like, right? Let's look at the first transition shown in the video, which shows one of the barrel stages loading. At this point, I think we can all pretty much instantly identify the 5-girder transitional frame that's indicative of genuine arcade hardware. What we have here in the first transition that we see in this video, this single frame by itself is already more positive evidence that this is genuine gameplay than we have in the sum total of all of the hours of Billy's footage. Moving on, let's look at the ending of one of the rivet stages to see if we can see the rivet ramp. Well, would you look at that? Even blown up to 400%, I'm willing to bet that you all watching this video can clearly see one more of the obvious indicators of arcade hardware being used, something that we curiously have never seen once in any of Billy's record footage. Now finally, let's look at the 2 different versions of the same transitional frame they showed at different times throughout this video, with one of them seemingly happening during a mini earthquake. Now looking at these 2 frames, at worst, by themselves, one could argue that they're inconclusive, given the poor quality, all of the ghosting and frame blending, and the potential for rolling shutter. But along with the other 2 frames that we've already seen, if you put a gun to my head and made me choose between arcade or MAME, I would feel pretty confident saying that this looks like arcade to me, especially the image on the right, as what we see here looks to me to be the first and second frames of this transition on arcade summed together, which would look exactly like this. So, with the deck completely and utterly stacked against us, in a situation far, far worse than anything Billy has, have a single instance of anything than multiple clear indications of genuine arcade hardware. So when it came to this little worst-case scenario case study, Jeremy Young presented was consistent with my personal findings. Now finally, it came to doing my own personal testing on an authentic arcade machine, which was going to be difficult considering that I don't own one, although I did have a bit of an ace up my sleeve. Anybody that's seen King of Kong, place, fun spot, the arcade where a noteworthy amount of the documentary was filmed. Now, believe it or not, I actually live within a reasonable driving distance of this Fun Spot location in New Hampshire, so I gave them a call, confirmed they had an original Donkey Kong arcade, and decided to make the pilgrimage there to test for myself. Now, unfortunately, I'm not very good at Donkey Kong. In fact, as far as I could recall, this is the first time I'd ever actually played the game. And I was also cognizant of the other people there that wanted to play, so I didn't want to hog the machine. But with that being said, I was only able to replicate a few of the screen transitions presented as a part of Jeremy's evidence package, but in my opinion, what I found was more than enough. Hell, I even managed to complete the Rivet stage exactly one time during my entire playthrough. What do you guys think? For my one and only chance at seeing the Rivet ramp, was I as unlucky as Billy? Of course not. When it came to all of the personal analysis that I did regarding the footage of Billy's gameplay, with my analysis of MAME, of third-party reference videos, with some unique use case testing, as well as everything I found on my little day trip to Fun Spot, as far as I've been able to determine, everything that Jeremy Young presented in his February 2018 post appears to be entirely accurate. Now, something else that was far too common at this point in the saga was people using evidence presented not only by Jeremy, but also from all of the random people that would end up flooding into the public dispute thread to share their half-baked theories, ultimately coming to the wrong conclusions or making bad arguments. Some people interpreted some of the evidence as indicating that Billy spliced his records, recording multiple pieces at different times and stitching the video together after the fact, something that was never seriously argued or entertained, at least by those we're discussing at the moment. Some folks interpreted the findings as suggesting that Billy played those records live on an arcade machine that was internally running MAME inside of it, something that was never claimed by Jeremy or any of the prominent community members seriously involved in the discussion. Now, interestingly enough, this narrative would ultimately come to be one of the most prominent arguments that Billy would latch onto for the next 5 years, dedicating the vast majority of his time to trying to debunk this one claim that nobody relevant ever actually made. And while the people jumping to the wrong conclusions or making unfair claims based on the data were far and away in the minority and were largely irrelevant to the conversation, whether intentional or not, I can't say, and whether it was based on ignorance or a concerted attempt to mislead, I also can't say, it appears as though Billy's response to all of this going forward was to employ an ingenious 4-step strategy. Step 1. Ignore any and all legitimate claims against you, and instead, construct a straw man and focus any and all responses on said straw man. Ensure that you always fail to understand every single aspect of the case against you, and instead, try to focus any and all discussion on the things that you understand the least, as well as the least compelling arguments that random irrelevant trolls made so as not to draw any attention to any of the actual arguments or evidence.
Well, the way the board draws, it's drawing vertically, and it should draw horizontally. No, Donkey Kong board. You play it on a TV. What do? Come on, smart lady. Now it's horizontal. That's why it draws in a different direction. So when I called the company that made the converter, they said, well, you're not recording off the monitor. That's why it doesn't look the same. You're recording directly from the board onto a TV. So we ran it from the board to the TV. It had the game monitor and it had a TV next to it. And it looked strikingly different, a different monitor. There was a 4-hour Facebook post. MAME, this is arcade, this is MAME, the same game, looks like arcade, looks like MAME. Because the camera doesn't capture everything. Captures very little, actually, unless you have the original tapes. Is there anything you can plug into a Donkey Kong board, into a Donkey Kong cabinet that would play like MAME? Anything. The only thing that plugs into a Donkey Kong cabinet is a Donkey Kong board. There is no MAME Donkey Kong in the world. Somebody who knows better, correct me if I'm wrong, because there's not. But nobody here has ever seen a Donkey Kong with a MAME board in it. It doesn't exist. We're chasing a ghost.
Step 2. If you ever find yourself in the position of being unable to ignore or avoid any specific accusations, be sure to respond with some half-baked, hand-wavy explanation, and then try to suggest that those arguments were never remotely reasonable, they've long since been debunked, and they originate from untrustworthy people with ulterior motives.
The way that it pops on the screen is not correct. Wait a minute. 3 other high-quality Donkey Kong players, their screens were shown on the footage that's on the internet to appear the same way at different points in the game. Gee, I thought we were okay. Gee, the board went to and from Nintendo. Gee, everybody was there.
Step 3. Contradict yourself whenever possible. In order to confuse your enemies to the point where they'll eventually be forced to conclude that it must be their fault that none of what you say makes any sense to them, you need to ensure that you remain as inconsistent as possible. This also comes with the added benefit of allowing you to shift to whatever narrative makes sense in the moment. Any chance you get to state something matter-of-factly that's clearly untrue and easily debunked, do so. At some point, they'll assume that you must know something they don't.
Notice the press release no longer says it's Maine. They just say that they don't think it's arcade. And it was recorded. And the game was recorded. And there's a room camera, just like one of these, 9 feet in the air, viewing down on the area. It took 6-hour tapes. They're part of the record. They were turned in. I don't have to record the game. I'm recording the game for my purpose. So when we do a movie, I got it. It's a better movie. We used a special converter so that it recorded directly off of the board, so that it was a high-quality play to be used later in a movie. Obviously, I like to do movies.
How did you even get in here anyway?
There are over 3,000 tapes, over 3,000 game tape world records that have not yet been collected by the current regime who has owned it for 4 years. There are 4 years. And I says, do you have the tapes yet? Oh, we're working on it. Those tapes were handed over to the referees. Those referees of those days will state in writing, yes, I saw the tapes. Yes, we brought them back to the room. Did you watch them? No, we didn't watch them. We didn't have to watch them because the score was done live in front of TG personnel. So they decided they didn't have to watch it. When did you last see the tapes? I last saw the tapes in the morning when they went out of the room. Do you know where they are now? No. What's more likely is, I'm sorry to say with bad news, is there was a falling out between that owner and basically every referee. And many of them told me that they took their stuff and threw it in the dumpster. My lucky guess is, along with a lot of other stuff, it was chucked and thrown in the dumpster. But those originals, there are no copies. That's crazy to me. What, you're going to make just... The original's got to be in there. The original's got to be in there. I mean, putting it in the game, locking the game, it's got to be in there. The room shot, showing me play all that time, has there been due diligence done?
Step 4. Confidently give the impression that you've effortlessly debunked each and every claim against you. And when they inevitably point out that you completely failed to understand literally every element of the arguments against you, make sure you accuse them of moving the goalposts and then claim one more victory in the fight against the haters.
But once again, they came up with a problem. Okay, we debunked what they had to say. Oh, let's move the goalpost. We showed that. Oh, no recognition. We moved the goalpost again. That was about the 6th or 8th time they moved the goalpost. It was never a congratulations. It was never a, oh, gee, we learned. We didn't know. Oh, I understand. Nothing. We moved the goalpost.
Despite traveling far and wide, attempting to control the narrative as best he could, Billy wasn't making much progress, at least outside of a small circle of simps that would be there to defend him no matter what the evidence said. As the weeks and months went on and the mountain of evidence continued to amass, more and more, day by day, it was clear that he was going to need some help, and fast.
Good day, everyone. My name is Carlos Pinedo. I'm an electrical engineer. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the Billy Mitchell video discrepancy dispute.
Carlos didn't know Donkey Kong, he didn't know Billy Mitchell, but what he did know was retro arcade electronics. After happening upon a random Facebook post from the owner of a local retro video game distributor that he had previously sold some miscellaneous arcade parts to, Carlos's interest had been piqued. The post was asking for some help or answers related to some interesting arcade hardware, and after a bit of back and forth, he found himself at Arcade Game Sales in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in front of a number of gentlemen telling a crazy tale of some antisocial, jealous losers on the internet in their unjust crusade to take down a retro video gaming legend. Ultimately drawn in by the prospect of having access to exactly the kinds of technology that he'd been nostalgically craving to get his hands on for years, to effectively be given free rein to conduct whatever tests and experimentation that he could want for free, while at the same time having the opportunity to help somebody in need is any engineer's dream come true. Little did he, as well as a few other members of a group that would eventually come to be known as Team Billy, know that they had just wandered their way into a hornet's nest, only to realize far too late the debacle that they had become a part of. You see, Carlos had come into this situation operating under quite a reasonable assumption that the folks that made up this motley crew of entrepreneurs, day traders, tech enthusiasts, and even a seemingly well-known and apparently well-respected public figure, a Guinness World Record holder and the subject of multiple documentaries, everybody involved here were all trustworthy, well-meaning, and informed, rational actors. There really wouldn't have been any reason for anybody coming into this situation to be skeptical of a handful of what appeared to be professional, responsible business owners, hobbyists, and family men, to assume that they were on the wrong side of a dispute against what had all the hallmarks of the stereotypical anonymous mob of toxic, frantically drooling internet trolls, let alone have any reason to remotely suspect that the person at the heart of this whole thing may not have been, let's just say, the most trustworthy of individuals. Both Carlos's introduction to this whole situation, as well as his exposure to the arguments and evidence being levied against Billy in the beginning and for quite some time after, had the unfortunate quality of having been spun, filtered, and distorted by Billy himself, whose impressive ability to confidently misunderstand and misrepresent all of the arguments and evidence presented against him proved to be quite effective at controlling the internal narrative that Carlos and other members of Team Billy had been sold on, beginning with the foundational aspect at the heart of this whole situation. Exactly what were people saying that was suspicious about Billy's gameplay?
The situation was the arcade and what Billy's tapes look like are completely different. My job was simply to demonstrate if the arcade can produce the images that we were seeing on the tapes. That was it.
In his mind, Carlos understood both the misconceptions and pitfalls related to this kind of technology, as well as the ultimate question at the heart of this dispute. He had not only the experience required to be able to test the claims being made, but also believed that he had what almost nobody else did, arguably the most important element of this kind of investigation.
I had access to the equipment stated was used, the arcade boards, the cabinet, the converter, even the capture card that was used for one of the recordings. This was stated to me that these were what was used. So no one else had access to this stuff. Everybody that would submit a videotape or record their video game at the time was simply a camcorder set up on a tripod or right over their shoulder, aimed to the screen, and you can see the person playing. Billy Mitchell's video submissions were different. They were done using a method now that everybody recognizes called direct feed. Direct feed was just something really nobody was using. With a direct feed, the cable itself is also transmitting the sync signal into the VCR or into the recording device or even the capture board. It makes a much clearer, a much better refresh rate, and the hertz of the screen are always matched up. Much better because the signal is hardwired. So I was really heavily in the impression of, oh yeah, it's all timing and syncs and camera.
At the time, I honestly believed Billy 100% everything he told me. What I had done was compiled a list of really good players. These were like top players like Weeby and West and Robbie, and I found their gameplay on YouTube, and I recorded that to send to the guys. When I mean the guys, I'm talking about Team Billy, the circle, where I go, look, everybody who plays the game, if you analyze the camera, long enough, you're going to find frames that just are missing portions of the girder. And they're like, oh, that is great, this is great and stuff. And I was under the impression that that's what they were holding against Billy. I had no question of what I was looking for. It was just based on information that was skewed. They were lying to me. So I was really looking for something that didn't exist.
Now, as Carlos did more testing and spent more time actually engaging with more of the well-meaning and knowledgeable members of the community that were still willing to actually engage in a dialogue with him, once he began to see more information trickling in that didn't exactly jive with what he had been told, once he dug a little bit deeper and began questioning some of his assumptions and started to do more testing outside of the influence of Billy, a different picture began to emerge.
And finally, I'm like, could it be a possibility that I'm being lied to? I bought myself an old laptop that had a video out. I bought an old CRT I found on Craigslist. I did that so I can test it myself. And all of a sudden, I saw it. Oh.
It's actually really a bit sad, knowing exactly how this all eventually unfolded, and then going back and watching him go through these explanations for the various elements of his testing, seeing what has all of the hallmarks of a guy having, 1, been conned by somebody intentionally feeding him misinformation, and 2, making the kind of mistake that honestly we've all been guilty of at one time or another. When we believe we have the right answer, believe we're more than justified, and then let that unfortunate combination of being overly confident and having motivated reasoning give you a kind of tunnel vision, making you blind to what's obviously right in front of you. The tragic irony of this video is palpable. Watching him analyze a bunch of different players' footage, accurately describing so many of the important elements needed to understand what's actually going on here, dismissing the evidence against Billy so casually and matter-of-factly, while simultaneously pointing directly at the evidence that clearly and unambiguously proves the case against him.
All of a sudden, I go back to watch myself. I'm like, God damn it. It was right in my fucking face this whole time. But I was under the impression that they were after Billy. Billy really had me convinced, so I did not put any faith on what anybody else was saying, especially after I started the investigation. There were people on that